I don't know about you, but I have really been looking forward to the Mortal Kombat Legacy Collection, yet somehow it just got worse. In a shocking move, both Mortal Kombat Mythologies Sub-Zero and Mortal Kombat Special Forces have been announced as new additions to the package. That's right, the two infamous spin-offs, most often spoken of in hushed tones, usually in the same breath as Never Again, are being wheeled out once more like corpses in a grisly parade. Now, jokes aside, there really were, believe it or not, fans literally begging for this. Apparently, some sick and twisted souls are desperate to wallow in the absolute low points of Mortal Kombat's history, as though the collection wasn't already buckling under the strain of its so-called legacy, weighed down by ropey console ports of the mainline titles as it is. No, for them, none of this was enough. So the current situation is their dream come true. But for the rest of us, it's the equivalent of someone spitting in our pint and telling us it's a vintage brew. So holding such thoughts, we've already examined Mythologies Sub-Zero in painstaking detail here on the channel, charting every frosty misstep of that ill-fated experiment in depth. So today, rather than going back over familiar ground, we'll be focusing on the even worse of the two offenders, Mortal Kombat Special Forces, because, believe it or not, before it became the disaster that limped out onto shop shelves, it was at one point envisioned as something altogether more ambitious, and almost, dare I say it, respectable. So in today's upload, let us collectively, yes, spelled with a K because why not, mourn this tragic turn of events. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. It's time to delve into the absolute nadir of Mortal Kombat's true legacy. Oh yes, this is where things get truly ugly. If, like me, you appreciate your collections big, bold and brimming with content, then be pleased that Mortal Kombat Legacy Collection is being handled by none other than Digital Eclipse, the very same outfit responsible for the excellent 13-game Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Cowabunga Collection. What's even more exciting is that you can pick that one up through my links for a frankly ludicrous 78% off the usual price. While you're browsing, you can also bag some equally ridiculous bargains on Shredder's Revenge, Streets of Rage 4, the latest Street Fighter 6 Season 1 and 2 Fighters Edition, and yes, even Fatal Fury City of the Wolves, now with a surprise edition of Ken Masters himself. So go on, indulge yourself, snag a few classics at a steal, and then settle back for today's video. Mortal Kombat Special Forces is perhaps the most controversial title in the whole series' entire lineage. This was Midway's second attempt at spinning the Mortal Kombat universe into grander horizons, and it belly flopped so hard you can still hear the splash echoing through history. Starring Jax, everyone's favourite man with biceps bigger than your average hatchback, this PlayStation exclusive was meant to be the bold new direction that would prove the franchise had legs beyond one-on-one combat, but instead, it proved that those legs were made of jelly. Today, the game is routinely held up as one of the worst Mortal Kombat products ever made, a laughable mess of clunky shooting, barren corridors and development drama so catastrophic it makes Mythologies Sub-Zero look like a finely polished masterpiece by comparison. However, to understand why Mortal Kombat Special Forces came into being, we must first look back to the late 90s, a period when the franchise was trying to convince the world it was still the king of fighting games, even as the crown slipped precariously off its blood-soaked brow. To get our timeline right prior to Special Forces release, let me remind you that Mortal Kombat 4 had landed with all the grace of a drunken bar fight, attempting to drag the series into 3D with polygons that looked like they'd been chiseled from granite, and less said about the cinematic war crime known as Mortal Kombat Annihilation the better. By 1998, Midway desperately needed a win. Enter the grand plan. After Mythologies Sub-Zero stumbled onto shelves in 1997 with a sort of critical reception usually reserved for contagious diseases, co-creator John Tobias was still determined to expand Mortal Kombat into a multimedia juggernaut. His vision was nothing less than a sprawling series of character-focused spin-offs, games that would flesh out the lore of individual combatants and turn them into headline stars. Sub-Zero had already been given his frosty solo outing, but hot on his heels were planned titles for Liu Kang, Baraka, Raiden, and of course the military pairing of Jax and Sonya Blade. Special Forces therefore wasn't some oddball one-off, but rather the next step in what was meant to be an entire anthology of Mortal Kombat adventures. On paper it sounded ambitious, even sensible. Take fan favourite fighters and build whole adventures around them, expanding the universe in ways the mainline fighting games couldn't. In practice, however, Midway were trying to launch this grand experiment at the exact moment the brand itself was wobbling. Mythologies had been ridiculed, Annihilation had torched the series' credibility on the big screen, and Mortal Kombat 4 had done little to convince critics that the franchise could thrive in the PlayStation era. Into this uncertain environment marched Jax, cybernetic, fists clenched, ready to carry the weight of the entire franchise on his shoulders. Spoiler, it did not go well. The origins of Special Forces can be traced back to John Tobias himself, the comic book-minded co-creator of Mortal Kombat who, despite Mythologies being laughed out of the room, still believed in the dream of spin-offs. His brainchild? A fully 3D, free-roaming action-adventure that would play like Tomb Raider meets Mortal Kombat, complete with climbing, swimming, firearms, and an all-new combat engine built from the ground up. This wasn't meant to be some half-hearted cash grab. Tobias pitched it as the technical showpiece that would put Mortal Kombat back on top, and finally prove it could stand tall outside of the fighting arena. The first public glimpse came at E3 1999, where the Nintendo 64 version was wheeled out for eager eyes. Unfortunately, the reaction was less fatality and more friendship. Critics were unimpressed. Midway started to get cold feet, and suddenly this bold new direction was being dragged back for retooling before it even had the chance to breathe. Still, worse was yet to come. In September 1999, the unthinkable happened. John Tobias himself walked away from Midway, and he didn't go alone. A chunk of the core development team, including lead artists Dave Michicic, who had been experimenting with revolutionary water refraction effects, and Josh Shui, responsible for much of the 3D modelling, who departed with him to form their own studio, Studio Gigante. That's right, the man who had spearheaded this ambitious new project left before it even reached the finish line, taking with him the people responsible for its technical and artistic vision. Imagine if Ed Boon had turned up to work one morning to find the entire team had defected to work on Tekken. That was basically the equivalent of what Midway was dealing with here. The cascade of problems that followed was as inevitable as a scorpion spear to the face. With both the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 teams gutted, Midway had no choice but to mash the survivors into one skeleton crew and cancel the other versions outright. The Nintendo 64 port dead. The Dreamcast version, which had been quietly planned, also scrapped. All resources were funneled into producing a single PlayStation release, and even that was held together with more duct tape than design. Still, this was just the start. There were even worse changes in store for the product. If you played this one, you will unfortunately remember this embarrassing outing as Jax game. However, this was not always planned to be exclusively the case. As mentioned earlier, development cuts would be made to the title, so therefore Sonya Blade, who was originally meant to be the co-star alongside Jax, was removed completely, despite being plastered across magazine covers and promotional material all over the place. In fact, prototype footage later leaked of ex-developer Josh Shui even showing us Sonya in full firefights against a black dragon, complete with unique animations and voice acting, all of which ended up on the cutting room floor. Cabal's entire subplot exploring his break from the Black Dragon and role as an informant was slashed to pieces. The level count was reduced from 7 down to 5, and ambitious mechanics like swimming, climbing, and free-roaming camera systems were quietly abandoned. What began life as an expansive Tomb Raider with fatalities was steadily stripped down until all that remained was corridors with guns starring Jax. In the end, Midway didn't just lose its creative director, it lost the very game he was trying to make. From the moment you pick up the controller, it becomes clear that Mortal Kombat Special Forces is not a fighting game, nor is it really an action game. It's more of a cautionary tale disguised as a video game. The camera hovers above Jax in a stiff third-person perspective that desperately wants to be Metal Gear Solid, but ends up looking more like a discount action figure wobbling around a bargain bin diorama. There is no jump button whatsoever, a decision that feels less like a design choice and more like the developers simply gave up halfway through and decided Jax's still legs weren't up to the task. After all, why leap majestically across chasms, wherein you can trudge around grey corridors like a man looking for the toilet in a nightclub? Combat itself revolves around the primitive combo system, with 4 face buttons for punches and kicks, a block and a turbo modifier that allows Jax to pull off special moves like ground pounds and charging punches. These abilities are tied to an energy meter which drains when used and only refills by smacking enemies in the face. To spice things up, there's a progression system that lets Jax learn new combos with experience points. The result? A list of attack strings with names so gloriously ridiculous they sound like rejected album titles from a 1990s nu metal band. Get some sucker, taking out the trash, the shocker. Yes, really. The irony is that most of these advanced combos were almost useless in practice, far too slow or complex to pull off in the middle of a fight. As most players discovered, you'd end up spamming the early super uppercuts forever because everything else was either too fiddly or too ineffective to bother with. It's as though Midway knew the game was doomed and thought they could distract you with comedy combo names, hoping you'd laugh too hard to notice nothing actually worked. But wait, there's more. Unlike Mythologies, Special Forces arms you with a vast arsenal of firearms. Machine guns, shotguns, sniper rifles, grenade launchers, even rocket launchers. Sounds exciting, right? Wrong. The auto-aim system locks on as long as you vaguely face an enemy's direction, which would be fine if it weren't sabotaged by the game's hideous fog and laughable draw distance. But these are just a few of the issues with the gameplay that can be experienced when playing this unholy relic. When it comes to using your weapons, ammunition management only made matters worse. Guns were designed for tactical situations, but ammo was so scarce that you'd constantly run dry mid-fight, forced to go back to clumsy melee attacks against machine gun nests. And when you did have ammo, the sniper rifle exposed a fatal flaw in the engine. Zooming in didn't actually improve draw distance at all. Enemies could see you long before the fog cleared, enough for you to see them. As IGN memorably put it, the game was utterly unplayable whenever a machine gun entered the frame. And then there's the camera, the true final boss of Mortal Kombat Special Forces. It is zoomed in far too close for ranged battles, constantly snags on walls, and has the uncanny ability to hide enemies just long enough for them to ambush you from off screen. Mythologies may have had its infamous turn button, but at least you could see what was killing you. In the end, Special Forces is less a game and more an endurance test. Mythologies was clunky and cruel, but it had ambition frozen under the ice. Trailing Monks, which later would prove that a Mortal Kombat action spin-off could actually work, blending combos, co-op and fatalities into something magical. But Special Forces, does this one have any saving graces? What about the story, for instance? Story-wise, Special Forces positions itself as a gritty prequel, pitting Jax against his eternal nemesis, Kano and the Black Dragon organization. On paper, this should have been perfect, a down-to-earth military thriller exploring Jax's origins and his vendetta against the criminal underworld. In practice, it boiled down to Jax hates Kano, Kano hates Jax, and that's about as deep as it gets. Subtlety was not invited to the party. Worse still, the game bungled its own continuity in ways that would have Ed Boon facepalming into the nether realm. Special Forces cheerfully presents Jax as already rocking his iconic cybernetic arms, except canonically, he doesn't get them until Mortal Kombat 3, so the game essentially turned him into Robocop years before he was supposed to be. Later titles had to awkwardly retcon this blunder by insisting his arms were enhancements rather than replacements, which is a bit like saying the Titanic merely spruced up its hull with an iceberg. That said, Special Forces did manage to accidentally contribute something of value to Mortal Kombat lore. It marked the first ever appearance of Tremor, the earth-wielding ninja who would later be revived as a DLC character in Mortal Kombat 10. Back in 2000, however, he was just another palette-swapped extra on the Black Dragon payroll, about as memorable as wet cardboard. Still, fans eventually adopted him, proving that even the most forgettable footnotes can claw their way into relevance if given enough time and a few particle effects. The game also fleshed out the Black Dragon, at least in theory. Instead of Kano being a lone lunatic with a laser eye, Special Forces introduced an entire rogues gallery of operatives like No Face and Tazia, names that sound less like hardened mercenaries and more like rejected G.I. Joe figures. Sadly, the execution was so half-hearted that these characters slipped into obscurity, leaving Tremor as the only survivor of a lot. The idea of exploring the Black Dragon's global operations could have given Mortal Kombat a fascinating expansion of its universe, but here it was a little more than background noise, a wasted opportunity buried under empty levels and poor storytelling. So yes, Special Forces technically expanded the lore, but in the most awkward and accidental way possible, by tripping over itself and spilling a few new ideas onto the floor. After staggering through development hell, Mortal Kombat Special Forces finally limped onto store shelves in June in the year 2000 in North America, with a European release following that September. What was once promised as a multi-platform blockbuster, as mentioned earlier, ended up crawling out as a PlayStation exclusive, and even then only barely alive. For reasons known only to Midway's marketing department, Special Forces was bizarrely dressed up with a tacky 1970s action movie flavour, complete with corny spy-style cinematics that clashed horribly with the supposed military realism of Jack's mission. It was as if they tried to make Shaft combat, only to bottle it halfway through, leaving players confused and unimpressed. Even Midway seemed to know they had a dud on their hands. What began as a bold, confident campaign was quietly scaled back to the bare minimum. The game shoved out at a budget price in what felt less like a release and more like a mercy killing. Commercially, the game was an outright disaster. Across this entire lifetime, Special Forces managed to shift around 210,000 copies worldwide. A pitiful number compared to Mortal Kombat's glory days. For perspective, Mortal Kombat 3 sold more copies in its opening weekend than Special Forces managed across its entire miserable existence. Midway had bet on Jax carrying the franchise into the next millennium. Instead, he barely carried it out of the bargain bin, but the reception would be even worse than the marketing. When Mortal Kombat Special Forces finally limped into players' hands in mid-2000, the critics unsheathed their pens like katanas, and they did not hold back. IGN slapped the game with a withering 3 out of 10, declaring it unworthy of purchase even at a bargain bin price. GameSpot went one better, or rather worse, with a 2.1, savaging the holes in the plot and slapdash level design, but it was Electronic Gaming Monthly who truly finished the job, detonating the fatality with a brutal 1.5 out of 10. To put it bluntly, the game wasn't reviewed, it was executed. On Metacritic, the aggregated score hit a miserable 28 out of 100, cementing its place as the lowest rated Mortal Kombat game of all time. Yes, even lower than Mythologies Sub-Zero. Rather hilariously, even a few scraps of praise were unintentionally damning. IGN noted the bronzer gleaming off the bodies and a handful of novelty license plates hidden in the environments, as though shiny forearms and Easter eggs were enough to redeem the rest. Other critics said the first few unarmed fistfights were fun, right up until the game handed you a machine gun and collapsed into chaos. And of course, Sonya's absence loomed large. The game that had once been sold as a buddy cop adventure now felt half finished, and fans never let Midway forget it. Retrospectives since have been no kinder. Hardcore Gaming 101 called it a game that crumbles under the weight of its nonsensical design decisions. YouTubers drag it out whenever they need easy content about the worst games ever made, and fans generally mention it in the same tone they'd use to recall a traumatic accident they once saw on the motorway. In the court of public opinion, Special Forces has never been pardoned. Perhaps the most devastating consequence, however, was what it did to Midway's grand spin-off experiment. Between Mythologies and Special Forces, two of the worst received games in the series' history, the whole character-focused adventure concept was killed stone dead. It would take 5 long years before Midway dared try again, and when they did, they abandoned Tobias's vision entirely, opting instead for the co-op brawler Shaolin Monks, which finally succeeded in doing what these earlier disasters had only dreamed of. In other words, Special Forces didn't just fail, it poisoned the well. And yet, time has a funny way of turning even the ugliest fossils into collectors' curios. In 2025, Special Forces is of course being dusted off once more and shoved into the Mortal Kombat Legacy Collection, ensuring that new generations can experience the historic car crash for themselves. Not out of love, not out of respect, but out of a grim obligation to preserve all of Mortal Kombat's history, warts and all. It's a reminder that the paths to Shaolin Monks and Mortal Kombat 11 wasn't just paved with fatalities and glory. Corridors, broken cameras, and Jax shooting blindly into the mist. Also, don't forget that if you're like me and enjoy your collections big, bold and absolutely stuffed with content, you'll be glad to know the Mortal Kombat Legacy Collection is being put together by Digital Eclipse, the same team who gave us the excellent 13-game Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Cowabunga collection. Better yet, you can grab that very collection through my links for a frankly absurd 78% off the usual price. And while you're at it, why not scoop up some more gems? Shredder's Revenge, Streets of Rage 4, the latest Street Fighter 6 Season 1 and 2 Fighters Edition, and yes, even Fatal Fury City of the Wolves, complete with the unlikely arrival of Ken Masters. So go on, treat yourself, fill that library, and I'll see you next time for another deep dive into gaming's strangest chapters. Cheerio.